Hey guys, sorry for the really weird lighting. I'm just gonna say hi super quickly and jump into our lecture. Last time we left off, we were talking about appeasement and how the League of Nations was like trying to get Hitler to stop. Um, but he had been taking all this land. And so we're gonna kind of jump in from there. So I'm gonna switch to my screen. Um, so, we have not actually yet talked about like the official start of the war, just everything leading up to it. So, World War One or Two officially begins in 1939 and lasts until 1945. So, everyone called World War One the Great War, the war to end all wars, and then fast forward, 20 years, and we're at World War Two. If you guys remember at the Munich conference with appeasement, Hitler had signed a deal that said he would not do anything else besides taking that Sudetenland that had a lot of Germans living there. Um, and he breaks that because he signs a pact with Stalin. Here's a funny little cartoon. It says, "Wonder how long the honeymoon will last." But he signs a non-aggression pact with Stalin. So it's not quite an alliance. It's more just like, we won't fight against you if you don't fight against us. Stalin or Hitler did not want to have to worry about splitting his forces like they had to during World War One, and actually Stalin had been in negotiations with England and France, and was kind of making it seem like he might ally with them, and so this was actually a huge blow, because it would have been great for Hitler to have to divide his forces, and this meant that he didn't have to, and so he signs this pact, and he says, "All right, let's make a deal to split Poland." Poland is right in between the Soviet Union and Germany. So Hitler attacks September 1939. He launches what becomes known as Blitzkrieg. Blitz is light, and then or light the lightning, and then Krieg is war. So Blitzkrieg or lightning war is pretty much when you send in heavy artillery. So you send in tanks. These are fast moving. Hitler's Panzer Division. It is not the slow little Willy tanks from World War One. These are fast moving tanks with heavy artillery. They're able to do a lot of damage. And then he sent in his Luftwaffe, which was the name for his Air Force, and they would just drop all kinds of bombs. They pretty much would like prep an area, and then following the planes and the tanks, you'd have huge numbers of infantry marching in to kind of like sift through the mess that was created by the tanks and the planes. And it was incredibly devastating and incredibly intimidating, and Poland falls almost instantly. And is split between Hitler and the Soviet Union. And so this is war. So France and England officially declare war on Germany. Just to show you guys these images, the United States, or sorry, France and Germany hated each other, right? That's why you had this Rhineland area that was supposed to be a buffer zone between Germany and France because of how much they hated each other. So France, after World War One, had literally started building. So they had fortifications all along here. But this right here, this dark red line, was known as the Maginot Line. They had built these super strong fortifications just to show you how much they hated Germany. It's literally everywhere they touched Germany. With these huge concrete, I don't even know what to call these, not a tower, with machine gun turrets in the top. I mean, they were fortified along this line. And Germany knew that. And so they declare war September 3rd, 1939, and French and British forces line up here along the German and French border. German forces line up here along the German and French border. They can see each other. And nothing happens. people jokingly, because they knew about Hitler's blitzkrieg in Poland, people jokingly started to say it's called Sitzkrieg because we're literally just sitting here, like sitting, doing nothing. And they called it the phony war. They were like, Germany's not going to attack. Well, Hitler had stationed his troops here, but in secret was planning an attack up north. So he, months later, you guys can see, so April 1940, Hitler surprises Denmark and Norway. Both fall, I believe it was Denmark fell in, it was either Denmark fell in a couple days and Norway took a couple months, or vice versa. I believe it was Denmark fell in a couple days, Norway in a couple months. But he surprise attacks from the north. So you guys can see he goes up this direction. He then, in secret, had the rest of his troops march down again through Belgium, sorry Belgium, and kind of sneak through the forest. He tried to do it as stealthily as possible, and pretty much, you guys, within 1 month, so this is April 1940, within 1 month, he had all of the Allied troops trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, France. So I want to show, I don't have a picture of it. Pretty much they were all driven to the beach of France. So he didn't just take Paris, he took all of France, and they were driven to the beaches. And World War II was almost over in a couple of months because, I mean, he had them in such a vulnerable position. Now, this is going to be kind of interesting for lecture, but I'm going to show you guys quite a few. I'm not going to show you the clips because they're going to copyright me, but I'm going to just tell you guys, one of your assignments for this week is just to pick any World War II movie. Try to pick one you haven't seen. If you've already seen one, that's okay too. But watch one of them, and I'm going to give you some recommendations. They do an incredible job. The Darkest Hour does a great job showing you Winston Churchill, who's leading the British at this time, what he does when it literally was the darkest hour, when Hitler had all of their forces trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. And then there also is a movie called Dunkirk that actually shows this like attempted rescue of the soldiers that are trapped on the beaches. So long story short, from the historical side of it, Winston Churchill calls upon the British people and asks them to use their ships, and there were 850 ships, because you guys can see here in the background some of the big battleships had been sunk, and it kind of like blocked access, and Germans were bombing from the sky. So they sent 850 kind of like commercial, smaller ships, yachts, whatever they had, to come pick up these soldiers on the beaches of Dunkirk. And in the end, they rescued 338,000 soldiers from that beach. I'll tell you guys right now, if they had not performed that rescue, World War II might have turned out a lot differently, because those same soldiers were the same ones that years later made up a big portion of the attack force that took back the beach on D-Day. So this was incredibly crucial, and I don't really know why Hitler stopped. He didn't keep sending in his tanks, and I think if he would have and would have handled this situation more aggressively, things would have looked differently. And I think that if Churchill hadn't have kind of like led in the way he did, there was a lot of people that were telling him just to negotiate with Hitler and to sign a peace treaty. And this is where he famously said, you cannot negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. So he was adamant that they needed to do something to stop it. Here are actual photographs of the rescue at Dunkirk. The soldiers that are just literally waiting there. Like if Hitler would have sent his tanks in there, it would have been over. Just waiting on the beaches to be rescued, and people did. So France has fallen, right? So they rescued them from the beaches, but France has fallen. So now England stood alone in this fight. And Winston Churchill famously said, we'll fight on the beaches, we'll fight on the landing grounds, we'll fight in the fields and the streets. We shall never surrender. So He was very adamant that they were going to stand up and against this. And Hitler begins. Well, he can't send in his tanks, which is crucial, but he does send in his Luftwaffe, and they continuously bomb London. You guys can see here. Here's just like England on fire. So airfields were bombed, cities were bombed. He was bombing cities specifically to break the morale, and bombing airfields to make it hard for the RAF, the Royal Air Force, to get off the ground. But one of the reasons that people in England were able to survive this was because of the development of radar. They were able to see on radar when the Luftwaffe were coming, so they would send out these sirens when the planes would attack, and the people of England would go down into bomb shelters or into the subways to hide, and so they were able to kind of withstand this attack. Because they were able to track planes. And then they also had an entire group of people that were trying to break and decode the German messages. The Enigma was supposedly this unbreakable Nazi code, and the Alan Turing actually, he actually builds the world's first computer in order to break the German code so that they can start interpreting and knowing where Germany was going to attack. And that was a crucial part of us winning the war. This is another movie that I would recommend called The Imitation Game that talks all about him building that, or shows the kind of like fight to break this unbreakable code. So if you're more, it's such a good movie. So here are pictures of England. Obviously, it was pretty devastating, the attacks that Hitler launched. But unfortunately, for Hitler, they didn't give up like he thought they were going to. And so he kind of puts aside his plans for England and instead turns his back on his initial ally. So just like a year, a little over a year after he had signed the non-aggression pact with Stalin, he decides, you know what, I'll leave England for later, and he decides to invade the Soviet Union. Obviously, Stalin was not prepared. The Soviet Union wasn't prepared because they thought that they had a non-aggression pact. So Hitler and his troops, you guys, they marched 500 miles in 1 week. It was insane, the kind of discipline and the sort of, aids that they used in order to get their soldiers to march that far that quickly. There's a lot of documented drug use during this time, but his soldiers marched 500 miles in 1 week and rampaged through the Soviet Union. Stalin used the scorched earth policy, similar to what had been done against Napoleon. And Hitler's troops laid siege to Leningrad. So they surround Leningrad and they're starving out the people inside. Stalin does not care. He told the people to just hold off as long as they could. 1 million people died in Leningrad under that siege. However, here is the kicker. This might sound familiar. History repeats itself, always does. They got in really quick, but this siege to Leningrad, they didn't give up. And so guess who gets stuck in the Soviet Union longer than he wanted to? Hitler and not Hitler himself, the German troops. And so winter comes and Hitler orders his men to not retreat. So he says they need to stay in the attack. You guys can see all the mud, and the soldiers came in winter clothing. They were not prepared. So it was absolutely miserable for the German soldiers that were in the heart of Russia. Now here's Leningrad where they laid siege, and then they also were going to attack Moscow later. But very, very brutal for German soldiers. So kind of keep that in mind. Meanwhile, there's an entire other section of the war that we're going to talk about next week, which is the United States fighting against Japan in the Pacific. I just want to throw this out there because the United States was not involved in the war up until this point, but December 7, 1941, Japan launches a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and in 2 hours, their kamikaze pilots sunk or damaged 19 ships. Over 2,000 Americans were killed, over 1,000 were wounded, and this pulls America into the war. So now, even though the United States fought most of the war versus Japan in the Pacific, they also sent quite a few huge numbers to Europe to fight against Hitler. So I just wanted to let you guys know that the United States is in the war officially because of Pearl Harbor after this point. So back to Russia. Hitler's troops again then try to attack Stalingrad, which is another major city in Russia, and they pretty much controlled most of the city, but again Stalin refused to have his people surrender, and so it takes Hitler longer than he thought it was going to, and so his troops get stuck there in winter again. So this is now another winter that Hitler's troops are having to stay and kind of withstand the Russian winter. And Stalin counterattacks, and Hitler again refuses to retreat. And except at this point, you guys, Hitler's soldiers were frostbitten, they were starving, they could not survive it. So 90,000 frostbitten, starving German soldiers surrendered. So it's at this point that Stalin starts pushing Hitler's troops all the way back towards Germany. So everything we've talked about so far has been Hitler expanding, taking. This is the first time that you see he's losing some of that land that he has taken. So you see it happen in the South as well. I haven't talked to you guys much about Italy. If we were in class, we would have maybe spent more time on it. But Mussolini turned out to be a bit of a disappointment for Hitler in terms of his effectiveness in the war. But the United States actually is crucial here. The United States sends in reinforcements, and they launch an attack on Italy from Africa, it's sort of like the launching point, and the Allies defeat the Germans in Italy. The reason there were Germans in Italy is because Stalin had to send in reinforcements for Mussolini. So they defeat the Germans in Italy, and they enter Rome. So they take Italy. So Hitler is like losing his allies. He turned his back on Russia, and now Italy has fallen. So resistance fighters actually found Mussolini. He was disguised. He was dressed. He tried to, him and his wife tried to disguise themselves. They found them in the back of a truck, immediately recognized them, and they shot him in the head, and then they hung him in the middle of a square because everybody, was sort of like, I guess, over Mussolini. Here's a picture of Mussolini hanging here. This is his wife. And then these are some of the advisors to Mussolini. You guys can see how many people are here in this square to see it. It was very public, very humiliating, and obviously the people of Italy had had enough. But this was a pretty intense, brutal way to do it. I'm going to show you guys a picture on the next slide. Just fast forward me if you don't want to see it, but it's Mussolini and his wife after they had been hanging upside down. So here's Mussolini, here's his wife. Both had been shot. So speaking of Hitler losing ground, so you see in Russia or the Soviet Union, they're pushing Hitler back from the south. In Italy, they're pushing Hitler north, and then from the west, this is sort of like the big moment, was D-Day, June 6, 1944, was the massive invasion force to retake France. So picture this, you guys, 1940 is when France fell. So for 4 years, Hitler had been building up fortifications along the beaches of France, and they had to try to storm the beaches. Everybody that's in the military will tell you this is the most difficult task ever. It's called an amphibious landing, when you have to take your boats or your troops, get them onto the beach to take a fortified beach. And so they, in England, they had assembled 3 million troops. The United States, a lot of those soldiers that were rescued at Dunkirk, and they attacked. They also, to try to throw Hitler off, created this whole dummy army. You guys can see here. They had like blow up fake tanks. They had men like practicing from parachutes, but it was really just these like dummies to try to throw Hitler off, to make them think they were going to attack further south. It didn't really matter. It was going to be difficult no matter what they did. It took them 2 months to fully break through. And if you guys, in terms of movies, want to watch Saving Private Ryan, it actually shows like how intense and difficult it was to break through those lines. But they finally are able to. So now you have the Allies coming from the west, from the north, or from the south, and from the east, and they're all starting to close in on Germany. Here's a clip from Saving Private Ryan, which I can't show you, but you can watch it. So Hitler starts to feel, and there's other battles that happen that we're not going to talk about, but Hitler starts to feel the pressure. All of the enemies are closing in. He has no more allies left, and so he marries his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, and together they commit suicide. Their bodies were burned. Their bodies were burned, and the Third Reich, which was the government under Hitler, officially surrenders. So May 9th, 1945, peace was signed. This is known, though, as VE Day. It's not known as the end of the war, because it wasn't. It was the end of the war in Europe. So VE, Victory in Europe Day, because the United States is still fully at war with Japan in the Pacific, and that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit next week. So that sort of is me taking you through the events of the war in Europe. And you guys have, just to mark that you watched this lecture, and you have to watch a movie and tell me a little bit about it. So hopefully it's a fun week. Miss you guys, and see you soon, hopefully.